Patrick Connor of QueensberryRules.com here with another episode of Boxing with the Beard. I apologize for the hiatus, but there was a lot of stuff going on, and anyways, I'm back, and I'm basically here to recap what happened this weekend. There was a lot of stuff that was going on this weekend. Also, if you've noticed that I'm missing my, I guess, somewhat now trademark glasses, it's because they broke, and I need to go get them fixed. So, in any event, if you see me peeking over at my computer screen here, sorry, but I can barely see anything at this point. In any event, the biggest fights this weekend, I guess I'll start with the HBO card, which was headlined by Sergio Martinez, middleweight champion, versus Martin-Murray from the UK. And I think that it wound up being a much more competitive fight than a lot of people thought it was going to be, myself included. I didn't know that Martin-Murray would be in the class of Sergio Martinez, but I think that there was also some lingering doubt in terms of how useful Sergio Martinez's legs were. And I think that some of that was answered this last Saturday. It was a big selling event in Argentina. It was, I think, about 50,000 people came to see it live, and it actually wound up being a pretty good fight, and I appreciated that much. But I think that as soon as Sergio Martinez was knocked down, I don't want to say that he looked terrible after that or anything, but he was losing rounds in a way that we hadn't really seen a whole lot from him in the last few years, aside from the 12th round against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. But kind of leaves some question marks in terms of where he's going to go. A lot of us would like to see him fight Gennady Golovkin, of course. I'd love to see that fight personally, if for no other reason that if Sergio Martinez is really on the decline or going out or on his way out or whatever, it would be kind of nice to see an official passing of the torch rather than kind of wonder what would have happened with that type of fight. But there are other options as well, I suppose. Peter Quillen, for example, is an option. He fought also on a different card, although I know that Sergio Martinez, HBO, Peter Quillen from this point out is going to be Showtime, but one can postulate, I suppose. But on the undercard, it was a split site undercard on HBO. They were supposed to have shown Luis Abregu versus Antonin Decarie, but that wound up getting scrapped on HBO basically because of weather conditions. It was supposed to also be a 12-round fight, but wound up being downgraded to a 10-round fight because of the weather. It actually wound up being a pretty good fight. Abregu is one of those Argentinian guys that's kind of on his way up, it seems. He started out losing to Tim Bradley in Bradley's first foray into the welterweight division in what I thought was actually a pretty decent fight. But Abregu has come a little bit a ways from that performance, I would say. And Antonin Decarie, I think that there were some kind of questions about him, but he actually accounted himself well, which was kind of the trend for the weekend of the guys who lost the fights accounting themselves well, and the guys who won overall not looking great, but getting the wins nonetheless. And I think that was kind of the case here, although I would give Abregu some credit. He got some rounds in, and that was actually a decent fight. If you haven't seen it already, I suggest you check it out personally. And the split site, the other site, the fight that was at the other site was Chris Arreola versus Bermane Stiverne, or I guess that should be reversed since Stiverne won. Not a lot of people knew exactly what Stiverne was going to bring when we were kind of reviewing the fights or doing our pre-fight analysis. We've seen Chris Arreola a lot. We've seen his kind of ups, downs, etc. We've seen a lot from him, and I think that for that reason alone, most of us were kind of riding with Chris Arreola, and it was disappointing to see him coming in fairly heavy once again. But I think at this point it's kind of something that's going to be expected. Unfortunately, I don't know that he's super skilled in general. I think his skills are a little bit underrated. But the problem is that when he comes in so heavy, he's not really able to use those skills. We actually saw him legitimately down and fairly hard against Stiverne, and I will say that Bermane Stiverne stepped up, took control, and seized the opportunity, as it were. boxed fairly well, and actually that was a pretty decent fight in terms of action too. So that entire HBO card was worth catching up on if you haven't caught up on it yet. And the other main card that night, the other triple header, even though the HBO card was kind of a double header more than a triple header, but the other main card that night was Danny Garcia versus Zab-Judah. I think that was probably the most anticipated fight of the weekend, and I think in hindsight it was probably the best fight of the weekend in terms of a higher caliber opponent or bigger named opponents, and having it be actually a better fight than many people expected. Danny Garcia, I think, has shown some flaws in general, but a lot of those flaws haven't been as apparent, I think, against guys like, for example, Eric Morales, who's, needless to say, in the twilight of his career and has gone downhill considerably in a fairly short period of time. And basically, it's kind of tough to see a guy really learn against a caliber of opponent like an older Eric Morales, or, even just Amir Khan, who himself was on the undercard and didn't look great. And so I don't know that we can draw huge conclusions even from the Zab-Judah fight that we saw. Basically, the way that I had it was that Danny Garcia was leading pretty clearly through about 7 or 8 rounds, but then out of nowhere, and including a knockdown, but out of nowhere, Zab just kind of hit him with a left hand that didn't really look like a whole lot, but he hit him to the body, and then he hit him with a left hand upstairs that just kind of had Garcia thinking twice, froze him up a little bit. He wasn't really very active after that, and he clearly slowed down, probably lost, 3 of the last 4 rounds, and it kind of opened the door, I think, for Zab-Judah to get another payday, even though he himself has been, at best, spotty and inconsistent. But at the end of the day, it wound up being a decent fight because Zab-Judah braved the early going, and he was kind of getting worn down, it seemed, and just basically outboxed fairly easily. And all the head movement, the juking, the jiving, all the moving around really awkwardly from Zab-Judah didn't really do him any good. But in the later rounds, I don't know whether it was Garcia's stamina and that he has a stamina issue, but in any event, I don't know that I would be super confident about that going into a fight against the winner of, for example, Lucas Matisse versus Lamont Peterson. Those would be really tough fights to have to be, struggling in the later rounds. Both of those guys would take advantage of that, I would imagine. Whether or not it would be successful, I don't know, but I would be a little bit concerned if I were them. He also kind of was fading in the first Morales fight before he wound up catching Morales, and that seemed to kind of give him a second wind. And in any event, good fight, worth checking out. On the undercard was Amir Khan versus Julio Diaz. As some of you know, Julio Diaz is one of the first guys I ever wound up covering for in boxing for a website or anything like that. He has fought in or around San Diego a handful of times, and I've seen him live a handful of times. Super nice guy, very approachable, a very solid fighter about 8 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. A very solid fighter, but just kind of long in the tooth, and he still wound up giving Amir Khan all sorts of problems and making it a very close fight. I don't know that I've seen anyone who scored it for Diaz, but I thought that he kind of had a little bit of a case to maybe take a close fight if you were scoring fairly generously for him. But the bottom line is that as much respect as I have for Julio Diaz, he hasn't really been on a huge win streak, and he's had a couple of pretty nasty losses in the fairly recent past. So if Amir Khan is really going to be struggling with him, I don't know that I want to see him in with a Floyd Mayweather like it's been talked about so much. That's a little bit ridiculous, in my opinion, in the wake of what we saw. He had really, really serious issues with a guy who wasn't a huge puncher, even at lightweight, and, I have to wonder about that, and I don't think that it means that Amir Khan is a bum or anything, but they're going to have to really reassess how they go about this comeback of his. But that was the second fight, I guess I should say, on the Showtime card. And the third fight was Peter Quillin versus Fernando Guerrero. It was a good fight, actually, despite being pretty dominant. As I said, for Queensberry rules in my post-fight analysis, it was about as good a fight as a domination can get. Peter Quillin was in command pretty much the entire way, but every so often there would be an overhand left from Fernando Guerrero that wound up just kind of taking him by surprise and getting him out of nowhere. And so I kind of, respected the gumption that it took from Guerrero to make a fight out of that, because he went down early, he went down hard, and he came back to make a fun fight until he was stopped. So I have to give some respect to him for that. He didn't really go out, just on his back when he basically could have early on. And I do give some respect to him for that. Peter Quillin, he's got a heck of a right hand. How much that means against slightly higher quality opposition, I'm not 100% sure about. I think that a Gennady Golovkin fight for him would be splendid. That would be a bombs away type of fight. I can't imagine it going any other way, and it would pretty much come down to who can land harder first. So I'm all in on that one. But on the same card as Amir Khan versus Julio Diaz, on the undercard of that, it was Deontay Wilder versus Audley Harrison. I won't spend too much time talking about that, except for that it was a brutal knockout. It wasn't a clean, unconscious knockout, but it was the first right hand that Wilder threw with any conviction, and it landed, and there was nothing Audley Harrison can do about it but basically sink down and not get up before the count of 10. Actually, I think he got up right at 9 or right after the toll of 9, but he was in no condition to continue. Of course, in the post-fight interview of his, he said he could have continued, he wanted to continue, but at this stage in his career, I think he's gone as far as he can possibly go. If he wants to go back, come back in a type of smaller, I don't know, a more local type of event over in the UK, that's totally fine. But sooner or later, getting banged up by these guys is going to take its toll. And Deontay Wilder, obviously he does have some power. I think that the big question with him, he's billed as a huge knockout puncher, and he obviously does have power. But the question is, will that power translate over when the opposition starts going up steadily? Now, having faced Audley Harrison, having that be the best opponent on your ledger so far, that's obviously not a very good ledger. So he has a lot to prove, but that type of power is something that can't be taught, and I'm always kind of skeptical about the fighters who are tall and lanky, especially in the heavyweight division today. But I'm kind of scared that they're not going to have any chin, but Wilder hasn't really shown that, not that I've seen. So there is some hope, I think, for him against a Klitschko, like in his next fight or something like that. I don't think so. I think they need to pump the brakes a bit on that thought and still develop him, because he needs to get rounds in. He needs to be tested before he jumps right into that, or else we'll see another, Lennox Lewis, Michael Grant, I think. And but that's at least something somewhat promising from the heavyweight division here in the U.S., which hasn't really come about for a while. And also another fight card that was on the headline of another fight card this weekend was Raimundo Beltran versus Alejandro Rodriguez. And that was a pretty decent fight itself. It wasn't scintillating by any means, but I thought it was a fairly interesting fight. Beltran is kind of on the way to rebuilding after a few losses, I think. I guess that would be a fair way to put it. He's had a couple pretty decent wins at the kind of B minus C plus type level over Ji-Hoon Kim, for example. I think on Friday Night Fights that was. So I think that seeing him develop a little bit more is good, and it's also there's a fairly deep talent pool in that vicinity for him to test it out against. How far he's going to go, I'm not sure, although I wouldn't bet on it being super far, but you should be able to find that fight online somewhere, and it's worth a gander itself. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the guy that I've been rooting for a long time. Johnny Gonzalez faced Akihiko Katagiri, and it wasn't a good fight by any means. Johnny Gonzalez looked to just kind of be getting rounds in. Katagiri didn't look to be a very quality opponent. He went down twice in the fourth, and then the bout was stopped. So, needless to say, Johnny Gonzalez is always going to have some power, especially against B and A minus level type of fighters, even though Katagiri wasn't even on that level. But whether or not he's going to be able to get back in line for a title shot, I'm not sure. I would like to see a Ponce de Leon rematch, actually whether or not Ponce de Leon beats Abner Mares soon next weekend. But in any event, I'm kind of interested just because I'm a fan. So I thought it was worth mentioning because of that. And also the last thing that I thought was worth mentioning was Terry Flanagan versus Nate Campbell. That was fairly sad to watch, to be honest. I watched a couple minutes of the James Toney versus, I can't even remember his name, I apologize, fight, and they were somewhat similar in that it was just a couple of guys that looked like they didn't really belong in a ring anymore. And I should correct myself. I didn't see a couple minutes of the James Toney fight, but I saw a big slew of pictures. But I did actually watch the Nate Campbell fight though, and it was just kind of sad. It was a guy who went from beating Juan Diaz to being out for about a year and not capitalizing on that momentum at all, and then going into, struggle against a guy like Ali Funeka, and then getting lined up for a fight against Joan Guzman, and that fight wound up falling through, and then he's been inactive, and then he's had a couple losses, and it's just been kind of a tailspin for him, I think, and it's kind of sad to see a guy go out like that and fighting what looks to be for the money. He's gone out on injuries, I think 2 or 3 fights in a row now. So, I don't know. I mean, I've never been a huge fan of the guy, but I think it's fair to say that he probably should be thinking about, calling it a day, in his own best interest. Not because I don't like the guy. But in any event, that is the sum of the show. If you could visit queensburyrules.com, that would be great. And also, James Foley and I, the hosts of Queensbury Rules Radio on Blog Talk Radio, we're going to be having a kind of special edition show for May Day this weekend. It's going to actually be on Wednesday. That'll probably be tomorrow by the time you see this, at 4 p.m. Pacific, and that is 7 p.m. Eastern. I had to think about that for a minute. But I think Tim Starks, the founder of QueensburyRules.com, is going to be joining us for a little bit to talk about some stuff, and hope you guys check it out. Have a great week. Take it easy.